So this week we're going to talk about a couple things. It's Parashat Bemidbar, and right after, right, the day. Well, it's Bemidbar in outside Israel, and I saw in Israel, but I'm going to talk about Bemidbar this week and I saw next week. Next week is actually the last class of the series, so yeah. I wanted to talk today about Bemidbar and its connection to the Shabuot holiday. So the first thing I want to do is we're starting a new book now, right? We finished Sefer Vayikra, and now we're starting a new book. And when we start any book, whether it be a Sefer Kodesh, or a regular novel, the title of the book is there that the author chose is there to give us the sort of opening or an idea or a little bit of a summary or a hint as to what the book will be about, right? It's usually some overarching theme of the book, or some main thing that the book's about, right? We know this in general literature and in Sefer Kodesh as well. So I want to look for a second at the names of the book and see how that's going to help us understand what's going to be coming in this sefer, in this book. So it's called Sefer Bemidbar, right? Parashat Bemidbar, and it's called Sefer Bemidbar, but it's also called by the Chachamim in many instances Chumash HaPekudim, right? The counting, and this is about counting and numbers, and this is where the Latin and English translation of the Book of Numbers comes from. So what are these two names, Bemidbar in the desert, or the Book of Numbers, Pekudim, right? What do these tell us about what's going to be in this book? Now, let's start with the Bemidbar in the desert, because it seems, it seems a little bit more obvious. At first glance, it seems very simple, right? It's called Bemidbar in the desert because the events happened in the desert, right? This book takes place in the desert. We transition from the more technical, law-filled book of Sefer Vayikra, and we go back to the narrative style of all the different stories that we have seen in Bereshit and Shemot. Yes, there are laws, but it's definitely more of a narrative style story than we have seen in Sefer Vayikra, right? And we see throughout the book, we see the experiences of Bnei Israel going through the desert, right? We see the events of the Meraglim. We see the man. We see all the different Korach. We see all the different events that happen in the desert, and it's their whole journey through the desert till we ultimately will be getting to the border of Eretz Yisrael, the Promised Land, where then Sefer Devarim takes place at the border, where Moshe is saying his final words before they enter. So it seems pretty obvious. It's called in the desert. Pretty simple name, simple summary. These events, these things happen in the desert, and yes, this is technically true, right? These events did happen in the desert. This isn't. This is obviously true, as you know, if you read the book. But let's look a little deeper than that, right? They, on a very simple level, it's in the desert, right? But why did all these events have to happen in the desert? Why did this whole process need to take place in the desert? Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, it did, because they had to get from point A to point B, right? They had to get from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, and they had to go through the desert to get there, right? They couldn't take a plane. It wasn't modern times, and they had to go through this journey in the desert to get there. However, we see that there was an alternative route, right? When they leave Mitzrayim in Sefer Shemot, when it talks about in Exodus, when they're during Yetziat Mitzrayim, it actually says, as a side note, like a narration, right? Vayhi b'shalach paro et ha'am v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karov hu ki amar Elohim pen yinachem ha'am b'rotam milchama v'shavu Mitzrayima vayesev Elohim et ha'am derech hamidbar yam suf v'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael eretz Mitzrayim. So we see that it says that, as a backdrop, as for the narrator telling us that when Bnei Yisrael were sent from Egypt, they could have went derech eretz plishtim, the way of the land of the plishtim, which was the coastal path, right? But and God, which was shorter, right? It was a shorter path on the coast, but God chose not to do that and sent them the path of the desert, because it says he was worried that, or not he was worried, he said that they would see war. They would have to, they would see the enemy and the plishtim, and they would have to be war with the plishtim, and that would cause them fear, and then they would regret leaving Mitzrayim, and they would return to Mitzrayim. So now this is very strange when you think about it. Like, what is this trying to show us? What are we supposed to learn from this? Because this nation has been what is the state of the nation right now, right, at this point? Because on the one hand, you have to think and say, okay, this nation was enslaved for hundreds of years in terrible conditions. Their children were killed. They were worked beyond any, physical capacity. They were really dehumanized and went through this whole horrible process. And wouldn't you think that, okay, I'll fight a war, I'll do whatever I can to get out of here, right? If I have to fight the plishtim, I'll fight the plishtim. There's no way I'm going back to the state of to what was going on in my state of servitude in Mitzrayim. However, this is something that God is saying. So obviously he's God. He's being the omniscient narrator here, and he's saying that this is a real threat, a real possibility that they could choose to go back. So why? What is in their psyche and in their makeup right now as a nation that's gonna push them to have this fear and choose to Mitzrayim over confronting a war? And confronting, and what does a war mean? A war means asserting yourself and knowing your identity, and knowing, mostly the most important thing about a war is knowing that you have something worth fighting for, right? You're not going to fight a war if you don't have something worth fighting for. So at this point, we see that the nation is in a very, very prime, immature state, and they don't know what it means to be free. They don't know what it means to have something worth fighting for. They have been with such a lack of identity this whole time that they're, that they don't know what it means to stand up for themselves, right? And even though the Mitzrayim was a horrible existence, right? It's familiar to them, and they're so afraid that they'll take the familiar over the unknown, even if the unknown might be better. And sadly, psychologically, we see this a lot with children, or with, God forbid, people that are in, abusive relationships, and they're in these bad situations, or it could be, you're not even to the extent of an abusive relationship, but let's say even, a lesser extent, but obviously something you don't want to happen, but something, a very bad job where your boss or your coworkers are treating you not well, but you sort of stay in that situation because it's familiar. And leaving the familiar means that you have to initiate change and start new. And that's something that requires a lot of work, and it's very hard. And especially in terms of a child, an immature state, a child or an immature person, they sometimes believe, and we see this a lot of times with God forbid, abusive situations, that the child believes that they have a fault in the matter, and it's their control, and that they should be in the situation and they deserved it, God forbid. Obviously that's not true, but this is where their immaturity and their psyche get involved, and it makes them stuck in this bad situation. And so at this point, we see that the nation was really at such a beginning state that they weren't able to know what that meant, what freedom meant, and what individuality meant, and what my fighting for myself means, and responsibility. This was all foreign to them. And so God said, I'm not going to challenge them where, give them a challenge that's going to be too hard for them, and they're very likely going to fail and not be able to push through. And I'm going to take them to the way of the Midbar. So why specifically the Midbar, right? Why? What is so beneficial or important about them taking this journey through the Midbar? And we see even before they are released and they are redeemed, Moshe keeps telling Paro, I want the nation, God wants his nation to go worship him in the Midbar, right? That God, the goal of all of this was for the nation to go worship God in the desert, and there he would give, the laws and the commandments and the Brit to the nation. And we take this for granted because we know the story, right? A lot of these stories that we've learned and heard since we were, children, we don't look at them with a critical eye because we know the ending and we're like, well, how else should it have been? But sometimes we have to think, why did it have to be specifically this way? So it does seem odd that the first request was to worship God in the desert. It would, in a way, it would make more sense, or it would seem more logical in a way to say, what God, I will take the nation to Eretz Israel, which was promised to the forefathers, and there, when they get to the land that was promised to the forefathers, then we will establish the Brit, we will build the Mikdash, we will do all these things, right? Why are we doing all this in the Midbar? Why is God giving us the Torah and the mitzvot and the Brit in the Midbar? Why are we building the Mishkan in the Midbar? Why don't we go straight to Israel and do it all there, right? In a way, doesn't that make more sense? Because then we're fulfilling the promise that God promised the Avot. Why is there this whole in between section? This almost delay of the desert. Now, I think there's a few ways to look at it. I read a few interesting things. I'm going to start with something that Rabbi Sachs says, and his approach is that because, which I think is an amazing approach, is because the laws and the covenant come before the land, and it comes when we are in exile, and we are in not only in exile, but we are in the vast expanse of the desert, right? Where there's no sustainability, right? And that's where we establish this brit with God, that because of that, it shows us that regardless of where we are as a nation, the brit will always stand. And our connection with God will always stand, regardless of where we are geographically. And since the foundation was started in the open vastness of the desert, it will continue anywhere, and it is not bound to one specific location. Where it would have been, his argument is basically sort of saying that if we would have done it only in Eretz Israel, then you would think that once we're in Galut, there's no more connection with God. And this is a very hopeful interpretation, and a hopeful, as we see in many other parts in the Torah, where it says, even when God pushes you out, and even when you're in Galut, there's always the opportunity to do tshuva and to return. So I think that this is the root of that, is that it's showing physically, manifesting that aspect of the brit, that no matter where you are, you always have the ability to reconnect and reestablish that brit with God. And I just want to, if anyone, I'm just going to, somewhat, I did many different, touring programs and hiking programs and things like that throughout Israel. And there really is, if anyone's ever been, there really is something so, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. So like there's such a dual aspect of the desert, because on the one hand, we're in a barren land, which is often very, very dangerous, very scary. There's barely any resources there, and what is there is dangerous, right? The animals and the insects and all those things are dangerous, and it's very challenging at all to survive. And this causes you to feel completely alone. And at the same time, on the flip side of that, because you have that feeling of being alone and not having the proper resources, you're completely reliant and dependent on God. And this allowed the nation and us as a nation to see the shift between slavery and freedom. What do I mean? That we shifted from the fact that Paro was our master, and now we're going to freedom where God is our master. And everything that God does for us is the exact opposite, in a way, of what Paro did to us, right? God is sustaining us, right? He is giving us the man to satiate us, right? And to provide for us. He's giving us water through miraculous ways, from rocks, from the be'et, from the magic, from the miraculous well that constantly came. He's protecting us from the elements through the ananei kavod, from the clouds, and he's sustaining us and providing for us in a way beyond anything that is even natural. And this is the exact opposite of Paro, where he took away all the natural things that we should have, right? He made our lives so impossible. He took away our children. He took away the ability, the straw and the ability to properly build, and we had to go deal with all that ourselves. He made everything extremely, extremely difficult and impossible for us. Where God is doing the opposite. He's making everything in an impossible situation very possible, and not only possible, but beneficial and miraculous for us. And this is sort of pushing us to see that true freedom means this relationship with God, where He will look out for the nation's best interests and sustain them throughout all these trying times. And so I want to take that idea for a minute, and those two ideas we just said, and now shift to talking about the other name of the book that we spoke about, which was the book of Numbers, right? Pekudim. And I want to see if we could look a little bit at this name, because on the surface it seems like it's not really such a great name, because book of Numbers, I mean, we see that it does make sort of sense, because in the beginning of the book, we count, Bnei Israel. There's a census of Bnei Israel, specifically all the males that are eligible to join the military to fight when they get into Eretz Canaan. But this does not really necessarily seem so relevant to the rest of the book, right? We have the census, we see it, and then it's sort of, we don't really hear about it. So why is this whole book? Why are they giving this the name, the book of Numbers? And I think this idea comes from another meaning of, like, when you count someone, right, you could physically count them, but you also have the meaning of, you count, you're significant, you matter, right? And this is, again, this idea of transitioning from slavery to freedom mentality, where in slavery, you don't count, you're just another slave. You're insignificant in the bigger picture of you yourself are not significant to your master, right? Because if you don't do your work, you're just going to have another slave do it, right? And however, here, when you're when you're being counted as God's nation, each and every person is significant. And we see this because of the words he uses of pekudim, right? And that word comes from pakad, right? And which is not only about counting, but it's also about taking into account and remembering. We see this from another couple of examples, this Vashem pakad et Sarah, right? God remembered Sarah Imenu and then gave her a child, Yitzchak. We see this with Yosef and his brothers, Hakod yifkod Elokim etchem, right? God will remember and redeem you. So it's not only about counting physically numbers 1, 2, 3. It's counting as in you count, you matter, you are significant. I am remembering and responding and seeing your individual significance in the deeper in the nation. And this is a much deeper connection. And this is seen through the book. When we are traveling through this vastness of the desert, we begin to count as a nation. We begin to become significant in our role as partners with God in his covenant. And I think this has to do also with the fact that they're the military, is because those men are going to be fighting to take over, to capture the land where we will be established fully as a nation in our sovereign land. And the desert is where we struggle repeatedly with the question, right? We see this throughout the whole book. Will we go back? Will we take the quote unquote easy way out, or the known way out, and go back to Egypt? And a lot of times they do say, I remember what was in Egypt, and they glorify what it was in Egypt. And it's not that they don't remember being slaves. It's not that they didn't know that. It's that they are afraid or nervous about embracing what real freedom and what that is. And through the transition in the Midbar, we learn that. And we see there's many challenges, right? We're going to see there's Korach, there's the Meraglim, there's the Mitonanim, there's all these people that are not necessarily ready to make it there. And therefore, we unfortunately have to take that 40-year journey to sort of sift out those that are ready to embrace that or those that aren't. What's interesting is that the Levi'im are not counted in this census. They're counted in a separate census because they don't go to war. The Levi'im are work in the Mishkan, right, with the Kohanim, so they don't go to war. They're not fighters. So that brings us to another question in a way, because why, when we count the Levi'im, you would think that the Levi'im should be counted in the book of Vayikra, right? It would make more sense thematically that it goes there, because their job is in the Mishkan, right, in the temple, and most of the book of Vayikra has to do with everything going on in the temple. So why wouldn't we count the Levi'im where we talk about the temple? Why is it that we're counted here when we're talking about the nation as a whole and not just the Mishkan, right? We spoke about this last week a bit about how there's this transition from Mishkan life to the Machaneh life, to the whole nation. And I think this helps us understand the fact that the Levi'im are counted here and not there. It shows us the role of the Levi'im, and that they're essentially the liaisons between the Kohanim and the Mishkan and the rest of the nation. They're living life in sort of both of these realms. They work in the Mishkan, but they also work with the people, because the Levi'im were the educators, the teachers of the nation. So they're basically bringing that Sinai Mishkan experience. They're so close to God on such a spiritual level, and they're bringing that into the nation, into the people every single day, leading us to our goal, which is to take that responsibility of freedom and that responsibility of connection with God and bring those values into the world as an order lagoyim. So it's a whole, not hierarchy, but a whole flow chart almost of bringing all these experiences and all these understandings of and responsibility of freedom, of covenant, of the Sinai experience of being so close to God, of this vastness and introspection and development that has to be taken into account during the time in the Midbar, and bringing us ultimately to be a nation of Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, to be a nation of those that are ambassadors for God to throughout the world. Now, how does this Midbar experience and the experience of counting connect to Shavuot? Well, counting is obvious, right? Because we have to count the whole Omer, right? We're almost done, right? A few more days, and we've been counting the whole Omer since Pesach, right? And so obviously we have to count the Omer to get to Pesach. And it's so significant, the act of counting and taking into account and processing the numbers and seeing where you are in the count, that we don't even have a date for Shavuot in the Torah. We only have it based on the counting, right? Based on how many weeks it is from Pesach. And this shows us that the love and significance that we should be longing for to the time of getting the Torah and having that covenant with God. And it's actually interesting. I follow this she runs a blog and an Instagram account called Busy Toddler, and she gives a lot of activities for kids and a lot of different just learning activities and games and things like that, and for a lot of younger kids. And one thing she talks about is because kids don't understand the concept of time. She talks about when there's ever a big event coming up, like a holiday or the beginning of school or a vacation, whatever it may be, then you make a paper chain, like the ones you put on the sukkah, and every day you take off one of the papers till you get to the day, and so they visually could see how much is left till the event. And I think that's sort of what we're doing in a way with counting the Omer. We're processing every single day, how many days is this till we get to Matan Torah. And actually, I actually heard something interesting in terms of Nida, a woman who's Nida, when she's counting her Sheva Neki'im, there is, I forgot where I saw it. It's a lone opinion, but I thought it's a nice idea, that there is this idea that every day the woman should say, in my first day of Sheva Neki'im, or my second day of Sheva Neki'im, like the same way you count the Omer, she counts her Sheva Neki'im, longing to reunite and reconnect with her husband. So I don't think that's that. I think I saw it as like a nice minhag idea thing. Definitely not halacha, but I just think it's the same idea of counting and taking into account and processing an event and something that you're longing for and that you appreciate and that you love and that you want to connect with. And we also, obviously, we know that the Torah itself, was given when I was celebrating Matan Torah, and that was taking place in the desert. And why it had, we spoke a little bit about, but I think there's also the idea that the desert has no distractions. There's nothing there. There's no hustle and bustle of city life, of everyday life. There's, you're fully committed to being able to bond and connect with God. And I think this is a lesson that we should take this time to step away, step back from the distractions, and just really be and really digest and really try to take in what it means to be someone that has this covenant with God, to what it means to be free, and what it means to be a member of Israel, and this connection we have through Torah and through our brit with God. And I really hope that for all of us that we use the time of the Chag. This year it's a long Chag. It's 2 or 3 days depending where you live. So it's time to really, I think, digest and introspect and really evaluate in our own heads what that freedom and what that covenant looks like for each person, because it is individual, because we all count. We all have our own significance in the bigger picture of the nation, and each one of us is a significant mark in the nation. And so we have to introspect and see what is my place in that, and what am I going to do to connect to that. So with that, Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Thank you.